In anime, there are tons of different ways to be powerful. You can be born with a power, you can be born with no powers and inherit powers. You can train in the power system of the universe you exist in to become the most powerful person around. Really, there's no one true route to power, and that's truly the beauty of fictional media. That within this one small subsection of media, the characters aren't limited by reality. Sure, we as humans can get real strong, but we're never gonna be able to throw somebody else through a building. And what's even more beautiful about fictional media and the differences in how people are able to get strong is that usually different characters in the same universe will take different routes. And this is usually exemplified in the fact that the good guys and the bad guys in anime usually get strong in different ways. And in no anime is that more clear and evident than Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. See, because the bad guys of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood are the homunculi, created entities siphoning off the power of the red stones existing within their chests, who never had to train in alchemy to get strong, they were simply created strong. However, the good guys of the show, the Alchemists, have to train in the power system that is alchemy within their universe to stand even the most remote chance against these homunculi. But even when taking things like training into consideration, some alchemists are just born blessed. See, alchemists in FMAB, much like any protagonists in any anime universe, have elements or categories assigned to their alchemy. Meaning, while all the most powerful alchemists obviously have to train and get battle experience to be the strongest alchemists they can be, some alchemists are just born with better elemental alchemy, while some alchemists gain massive power by entering the Gate of Truth. There really is no one true way to become a powerful alchemist, and that's why describing which alchemist is the strongest in FMAB is kind of a difficult task. But undergoing difficult tasks is kind of what I do best. Which is why today we're talking the top 10 strongest alchemists in FMAB, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking or explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me talking about your favorite animes, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything happening in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood as a show is not long. It's less than 70 episodes. However, in the course of those 60 or so episodes, it feels as though Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood introduced a roster of characters as deep and well explained as shows with 200 or 300 episodes. We're introduced to a powerful, interesting, and complicated villain force in the homunculi, a vast military force in the form of the Emestrian military, those who have been affected by the Emestrian military, like the Ishvalans and Scar, obviously Ed and Al, and even people from the bordering country of Xing like Mei Chang. And in arguably the shortest mega shonen in existence, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood manages to introduce us to tons of characters who all gained their power in vastly different ways. So pulling from that vast, deep, and well-explained list and only finding 10 alchemists was a bit difficult, but not impossible. But with this being a top 10 list, every alchemist on this list is a legitimate contender to be one of the strongest characters in the universe. But unfortunately, somebody's gotta take last place. So coming in last place, also known as 10th, we have Basque Grand. Basque Grand is a brigadier general in the Emestrian military, one of the highest ranking officers in the Emestrian military, mind you. He is known as the Iron Blood Alchemist, and was known far and wide for his military accolades during the Ishvalan War. However, unfortunately, because he was so well known for his military accolades during the Ishvalan War, he is very specifically one of the people that Scar was hunting down in Emestria. Which is why, unfortunately, rather early on in the series, the Iron-Blooded Alchemist is killed by Scar. However, being killed by Scar doesn't mean you can't be on this top 10 list, as Scar is also one of the most powerful alchemists in the entirety of FMAB. And not to mention, everything that we saw from Basque Grand prior to his death at the hands of Scar was insanely impressive. See, unfortunately, when you're looking at the modern day feats of Basque Grand, there's not a lot, because Basque Grand is one of Scar's earliest victims, which means pretty much as early as he shows up, he also leaves. However, in chapter 60 of the manga, we get to see Basque Grand on the front lines of the Ishvalan War, and it's in that moment that we got to see the true level of alchemist that Basque Grand was. I mean, he had to earn the title of Brigadier General somehow. Now we learn from this flashback and his battle against Scar where this title came from, and that was his iron-blooded alchemy. See, Bask Gran actually transmutes in a way very similar to that of Ed Elric. See, Bask wears 2 iron gauntlets on his hands, and on each gauntlet is half of a transmutation circle. By slamming these 2 gauntlets into each other, he creates a transmutation circle, which allows him to begin transmuting. And usually Bask transmutes the rock and stone around him into massive weapons or cannons. And in chapter 60, we see him transmute an entire building into an armament of weapons, that being several Gatling guns, several cannons, and a bunch of chains trying to catch an enemy. And strictly for the fact that he is able to, through his iron-blooded alchemy, transmute an entire building into weapons, we can't help but acknowledge the fact that he might be one of the strongest alchemists in the entire universe. And this wasn't the only time he did this. Obviously, in his battle against Scar, we also saw him slam his gauntlets together and make an arsenal of cannons to fire cannonballs at the encroaching Scar. Pretty much everything that we saw from Bask Gran in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood showed that he was a walking arsenal, with the ability to make anything that he transmuted into an arsenal of cannons or Gatling guns or spears with chains connected to them, all of which he was able to fire at high intervals with deadly accuracy. And genuinely, only the strongest alchemists on Earth would stand a chance against him, like Scar. However, Scar killing Bask actually might have been luck for Scar, because in an omake, also known as an extra, which is kind of like a Gonin Killua's Hunterpedia type thing, mangaka of FMAB actually explained that the only reason that Scar was able to kill Bask in the first place is because Scar caught Bask as he was leaving a pub. And while technically this isn't depicted in the 2009 anime, this was stated after the manga was released, who also obviously underestimated Scar, believing that the metal walls he built around him would be enough to contain him, when in actuality, they were not. So do I believe that Bask Gran, a character killed so early on in the story that a lot of you probably don't even remember who he is, deserves to be on this list? Yes. Yes, I do. But enough about characters you probably don't remember. Let's get to characters that I would definitely hope you would remember, because coming up at number 9, we have Alphonse Elric.
Nick, what do you mean Alphonse is number 9 on this list? He's one of the main protagonists.
Yes, of course, he is one of the main protagonists, but he's also definitely not one of the strongest alchemists in FMAB. Just being on screen a lot doesn't mean that Alphonse is the world buster of FMAB. He's strong, and he gets a lot stronger throughout the duration of the show, but number 9 on this list is a very appropriate placing for Alphonse. See, Alphonse exists only as a soul, alchemically bound to an old suit of armor. As to why the Elric family just had an old suit of armor kicking around, I don't think we'll ever know. But it is objectively a really cool suit of armor. And while obviously that leads to a somewhat torturous existence for Alphonse, as not only can he not sleep, he also can't eat or drink water, and basically he just exists as a suit of armor 24 hours a day. No touch, no sleep, no food. But at least he gets to talk to his brother and go on a grand old adventure. Well, that does sound like a curse. It's also kind of an upgrade. Not the whole not sleeping, not tasting, not feeling thing. Well, actually, maybe the not feeling thing, because here's the thing. Alphonse technically doesn't have vital points. He has a vital point, and that is the blood that's used to alchemically bind his soul to the suit of armor. But so long as that seal isn't broken, you can stab Alphonse pretty much wherever, and he'll be fine. Decapitate him, stab him through the heart, cut off his arm. All of it really won't affect him. On top of this, Alphonse lives in a body which is entirely transmutable. Well, Ed will transmute his automail arm. Alphonse, living in a body of metal, is able to transmute any part of his body. But suit of armor or not, most of Alphonse's abilities come from the fact that he trained under Izumi Curtis, inarguably one of the strongest alchemists of all time. And actually, Alphonse is technically a better fighter than Ed. Ed has stated that ever since Alphonse and him trained with Izumi Curtis, that Ed hasn't beaten him in a hand-to-hand fight. That is to say that Alphonse is technically a better close-quarter combat brawler than Ed. I mean, technically, a lot of that might be tied to the fact that, let's remind you, that Alphonse is just the soul, and therefore he has unlimited stamina. Heat doesn't affect him. He's bulletproof. But he does have weaknesses, like if he's accidentally thrown in a large body of water, the blood that's used to make his seal will wash away, and he dies. On top of this, Alphonse, just like his older brother, is also a genius in all things alchemy, though not as much as Ed. However, he does share one thing in common with Ed, and that is because his body has passed through the gate of truth, he has the ability to transmute without the use of a transmutation circle. However, Alphonse technically has to awaken to this ability, as it's not until roughly chapter 30 that Alphonse realizes that he can use transmutation without the drawing of a transmutation circle, something that he had seen his brother do multiple times. Now, Alphonse, like a lot of other people on this list, list doesn't necessarily have an elemental alchemy style. However, his intellect comes into play in almost every single battle that he ever finds himself in, where Alphonse would do things like creating traps or flashbangs to stun and trap his enemies. Not to mention that his alchemy is also stated to have an incredible eye for detail. That is to say that anything that Alphonse creates appears as though it was always what he created. If he creates a pole arm out of the ground, it looks as though it was always a pole arm, not a pole arm created from the earth. But Alphonse also has shown the capacity to go beyond just creating traditional weapons. See, Alphonse has shown the ability to play with the alchemical makeups of the weapons he's created to make them have attributes they wouldn't usually have, like when he created a flexible sword to throw his opponent off guard. And with the power of these flashbangs, flexible swords, and traps, Alphonse was able to go toe-to-toe with the likes of Pride and Kimberly simultaneously. Now, obviously, he was able to pull all of this off because he was also wielding a Philosopher's Stone, so chalking up all of these feats to his alchemy is kind of a stretch, as within the capacity of this fight, he was able to go beyond the laws of equivalent exchange. But this fight does do a really good job of showing off Alphonse's immense battle IQ, and thus, he's getting number 9 on this list. But since we're talking about people who can use alchemy without transmutation circles, we should talk about our number 8 entry, Scar. Now, Scar is a survivor of the Ishvalan War, one of the people whose entire life was destroyed by Amestria trying to shed a massive amount of blood in a specific spot so that they could make the entirety of Amestria into a transmutation circle. However, Scar wasn't privy to this information. He simply just saw Amestria destroying his country and everybody that he loved, and thus Scar dedicates the majority of his life to destroying Amestria one soldier at a time, which leads him into combat with some of Amestria's strongest alchemists, people like Bas Grand. Long before Scar went on his revenge tour, he was a warrior monk in the country of Ishval, meaning before even the Ishvalan Civil War, he was an incredibly adept close-quarter combat fighter, which allowed him to train up his strength, his speed, his stamina, to the point where his speed was so great, he's shown dodging bullets multiple times. But Scar showing up and battling against one of the strongest Amestrian alchemists of all time, Bas Grand, who is hailed as a combat specialist akin to Roy Mustang, mind you, Scar has also been shown going toe-to-toe with the likes of the Elric brothers and Alex Armstrong, who, spoilers ahead here, are all on this list. But genuinely, all of those fights pale in comparison to Scar's most impressive battle, when he was able to fight against, albeit a heavily injured Wrath, to kind of victory, more like a tie. But still, even battling against a severely injured Wrath and bringing him to a tie is very impressive when we consider the fact that Wrath was able to cut down almost the entirety of the Mestrian military by himself. And in this fight, not only does Scar show off a tenacity and willingness to go as far as necessary to gain victory, but also shows off the fact that he is actually a very intelligent alchemist who can read a situation and use different kinds of alchemy to make sure that that situation works out in the best possible way for him. But Scar's alchemy manifests in a weird way. See, Scar's favorite weapon is his right hand, which is able to destroy anything it comes into contact with. Now, the reason that his right arm is able to do this is because on his right arm, there's a complicated arcane transmutation array tattoo, which, if I didn't have these, I'm just now realizing would have been so cool to have. See, Scar doesn't actually consider himself, at least when he's using his right hand, to be an alchemist, because in alchemy, you have to take 3 things into consideration: comprehension, destruction, reconstruction. But Scar, through the usage of his right hand, only does the first 2 things, comprehension and destruction, and therefore anything that he grabs onto with his right hand and pumps his alchemy into, he destroys but never remakes. Now, this is mostly because the Ishvalan god believes that humans shouldn't give new shape or form to the things that God created, and as Scar was an Ishvalan battle monk, his belief in God is actually very core to his personality, and therefore the act of reconstructing a human or something else would go against his beliefs, but it mostly applies to humans. However, it's revealed in chapter 103, prior to Scar's battle against Wrath, that he's actually found a way to decipher the deconstruction tattoo on his right arm and apply it to create a reconstruction tattoo on his left arm, which is why in his battle against Wrath, he's able to surprise Wrath by creating spikes out of the ground that stop Wrath from stabbing him, as people believe that Scar for the longest time was only capable of deconstruction. But now, with the power of deconstruction in his right hand and the power of reconstruction in his left hand, Scar is just straight up an alchemist. And considering with what he was able to do with just the right arm ability, him gaining the whole left arm ability definitely made him a whole lot stronger. So yes, beyond a shadow of a doubt, does Scar belong on this list? Yeah. But is he as strong as our next entry on this list? Maybe not, because coming in at number 7, we have Alex Armstrong. Alex Armstrong, besides being probably the greatest character in anime history, is also incredibly strong. He shows that off. I mean, flexing is literally 50% of his personality. See, Alex Armstrong is the strongest member of the Armstrong family, and the Armstrong family is an incredibly powerful pseudo-royal family within the confines of Amestria. Alex is probably the most formidable hand-to-hand combatant in all of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. That is to say, when it comes down to straight fists, he's probably the last person you want to fight, as Alex has gone toe-to-toe with people like Scar and the Chimera Roa, who is probably the strongest out of Greed's Chimera, though not all that fast. But in order to make up for the lack of speed that Roa had, he compromised with strength. But genuinely, Alex's most impressive fight is in his battle against the homunculus Sloth, where Alex proves that with his boxing style alchemy, he's able to actually damage Sloth, something that bullets, tank shells, and rockets could not do, meaning that Alex, with the power of his boxing alchemy, is stronger than a missile. Now, Alex's alchemy works in a very similar capacity to Boss Grant, where he dons two brass knuckle type gauntlets that he can smash together to create a transmutation circle. Then, upon slamming these gauntlets into something he wants to transmute, he's able to transmute with a high level of detail, mind you, whatever he wants to, and launch it at his opponents. Now, mind you, Alex Armstrong's alchemy is also some of the fastest in the series. That is to say that his alchemical constructs come out faster than anybody else's. Not to mention, his alchemical constructs are said to be some of the strongest in the series, as the spikes that he was able to generate were able to punch through Sloth with relative ease. However, this doesn't mean that Alex always has to fight up close, as Alex is also considered to be Amestria's heavy artillery, as he can transmute the ground into shells and punch them for miles, allowing him to attack enemies that he may not even be able to see. And considering the fact that he's one of the few state alchemists who survived the battle against Scar, yeah, I'm gonna put him on the list. And yes, I'm gonna put him higher than Scar. I think Scar was pressed in his battle against Armstrong, though obviously Armstrong had backup, and I think if it genuinely came down to it, Armstrong takes the W against Scar. But it's hard to say. If you think Scar's stronger than Armstrong, genuinely, I can't even really disagree. When you consider the fact that Scar later got the ability to reconstruct things and therefore actually do alchemy later on in the story, it would be a really, really close fight between the two of them. But enough about all these men. Let's get to some women, because coming in at number 6, we have Izumi Curtis. See, Izumi Curtis isn't actually an active soldier. She's a master alchemist and an incredibly proficient martial artist, but within Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, she runs a butcher shop with her husband, Sig. And Izumi Curtis was never a member of the Amestrian military or anything like that. She just wanted to be an alchemist and trained under a man by the name of Silver Steiner, who made her survive for a month alone in an incredibly treacherous area in Amestria known as the Briggs Mountains, where, in order to survive, she routinely had to fight bears, which is also ironically how she met her husband, because he dropped a bear he was carrying after defeating. And when you meet another person who also fights bears, I guess it's love at first sight. See, what's truly wild about Izumi Curtis is that the version of her that we see is nowhere near her full power. See, while usually Izumi appears as this unbeatable tower of power, after every time she does something impressive, she coughs up a bunch of blood. Now, this is because Izumi is one of the few people in the show who has attempted human transmutation, and her penalty for passing through the gate was the loss of the majority of her internal organs. However, later on in the manga and the anime, Van Hohenheim actually rearranges all of her internal organs, and not in the way that you're thinking. She has a husband who loves her, which actually improves her health massively, pretty much getting rid of the nerf in the first place, which allows her to continue being the absolute tower of power that she used to be. But even with the majority of her internal organs missing, Izumi is still terrifying. See, Izumi is a self-taught master alchemist, and because she's self-taught, her alchemy very much matches her personality. See, Izumi uses her surroundings to her advantage. She identifies the things around her and how she could use them to put her opponent at the largest disadvantage possible, which speaks to the insane level of battle IQ that she has. But this battle IQ is also matched by the insane level of alchemy mastery that she has, as Izumi has been shown to do something that no other alchemist all throughout FMAB has ever been shown to do. See, Izumi has the ability to knock somebody out by transmuting the ions in their body. That is to say, by disrupting the flow of the ions running throughout your nervous system, Izumi is able to knock people out, which is the height of her identifying things around her that she could use to put her opponent at a disadvantage. They're actual body. Not to mention, since Izumi Curtis has passed through the Gate of Truth, she also has the ability to use alchemy without the use of a transmutation circle, and thus she's able to activate her alchemy much faster than most other alchemists, with only people like Alphonse and Ed being able to match her speed. And to match her mastery over alchemy, she's also one of the physically strongest people in the entire universe, as like I said, she used to fight bears for survival and also was shown to be strong enough to knock Sloth back. And this was non-peak Izumi, missing the majority of her internal organs. In fact, it's pretty much stated that the only people who could give Izumi a run for her money in terms of strength are her husband Sig and Alex Armstrong. And then I guess obviously Sloth. But sometimes strength doesn't get you as far as you would like. Because coming in at number 5, we have Sulph J. Kimberly, also known as Kimberly, the Crimson Lotus Alchemist. Kimberly is a former state alchemist who now works explicitly under Fuhrer King Bradley. Kimberly wields one of the strongest types of alchemy in all of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, combustion alchemy. However, during the Ishvalan Civil War, he decided to combust a whole bunch of civilians, and thus he was jailed in Central City. However, because he was an incredibly powerful alchemist, and Amestria was already a really bad place, it's just a lot of people didn't know that, Fuhrer King Bradley was like,
Yeah, I need that guy. Let's exonerate him.
and thus he became Fuhrer King Bradley's secret left-hand man. Kimberly's alchemy is manifested through the 2 transmutation circles he has tattooed on his palms, and both of these tattoos are circles with triangles within them, and therefore when Kimberly claps his hands together, he creates a hexagram, and a hexagram within a circle creates a transmutation circle. However, on one hand is the symbol for the sun, and on the other hand is the symbol for the moon, and therefore when he clasps these 2 hands together, he creates a contradictory transmutation circle, as this transmutation circle is built with the properties of the sun and the moon, 2 polar opposites, and therefore anything that Kimberly touches and transmutes becomes incredibly unstable, which means anything that he transmutes gets into a very unstable state, making it highly explosive, which is why anything that Kimberly transmutes eventually explodes. But he also has the ability to do regular transmutation, like the non-explodey kind. The true most fearsome part about Kimberly's combustion alchemy is the fact that he can transmute this instability to a place far away from where he's currently standing. And that is to say that he's able to transmute an explosion incredibly far away from himself, giving him long-range combustion abilities. And as we learned from the legendary Roy Mustang, if your alchemy can either burn or explode, you're gonna be one of the most powerful people in the universe. But since we're talking about Roy Mustang, let's talk about Roy Mustang, because he is our number 4 entry.
What, Nick? Roy Mustang's coming in at number 4?
Yeah, he is, and you'll understand why at the end. Roy Mustang might as well be the protagonist of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and a lot of people consider him the 3rd protagonist of the show. He's a state alchemist and an officer in the Amestrian army, a hero of the Ishvalan War, and basically just the last dude you want to piss off in all of Amestria, which is why he very justifiably has dreams of being the next Fuhrer of Amestria. Just realize it's Amestris, not Amestria. I've been saying it wrong this entire time. Wait, then are they Amestrians? No, it's gotta be Amestrian still. But the real reason that you don't want to piss off Roy Mustang is his alchemy. See, in basically all categories that make somebody a good alchemist, Roy Mustang excels. Whether it be physical transmutation, biological alchemy, or just theory, he's pretty great at all of it, even amongst his other senior officers in the Amestris army. Now I don't even know what I'm trying to say anymore. But the real reason that Roy Mustang is as high on this list as he is the fact that his alchemy is flame-based. See, Roy has a pair of pyrotechs, or ignition cloth gloves, that whenever he snaps, they generate a spark. And on the back of these ignition cloth gloves are transmutation circles, and therefore Roy doesn't need to draw a transmutation circle before he uses his flame alchemy. He simply needs to have his gloves on. But how does Roy Mustang's flame alchemy actually work? Well, because this is FMAB, we have an actual scientific answer. See, Roy doesn't actually control fire. He controls oxygen density. See, for those of you who don't know, oxygen is incredibly flammable, though only in condensed states. Obviously, oxygen naturally exists in the air that we're breathing, but oxygen is by far and away not the most bountiful element in air. That would be nitrogen. 78% of the air that we breathe is nitrogen, while only 21% of the air we breathe is oxygen. And Roy has the ability to pull oxygen towards a target, and thus by surrounding a target with an unusual amount of oxygen, the atmosphere around them becomes incredibly volatile, and therefore very susceptible to explosions. Now, Roy Mustang's control over oxygen is next level. Roy doesn't just gather a bunch of oxygen around somebody and pop it. Roy has to draw lines between himself and his target with a highly dense, narrow line of oxygen, which is why Roy can use his flame alchemy around allies, because he could simply create a tunnel of oxygen to an enemy around an ally. Roy also saves different attacks for different hands, with Roy's right hand being for his large, explosive attacks, and his left hand being for smaller, pinpoint, precise attacks. Now, unfortunately, when Roy's gloves get wet, they're kind of useless, which leads a lot of people to believe that Roy Mustang is useless in the rain. However, the only reason that Roy Mustang is somewhat useless in the rain is because his gloves can't produce a spark. However, if he just has a lighter or a cigarette or any other ignition source, he's still able to use his flame alchemy, which is why we see him using a lighter against lust. However, since he didn't have his gloves in this battle against lust, he had to carve a transmutation circle into his hand. Personally, I'm just taking one out of Scar's notebook here. Just get a tattoo. However, carving transmutation circles into his hand would become unnecessary later on in the story for Roy, as Roy is forced to do human transmutation by pride, which puts him through the gate of truth. And in exchange for his eyes, which he later gets back, Roy gains the ability to do alchemy without a transmutation circle. However, now that he no longer needs a transmutation circle to do alchemy, he's realized that he can do more than just flame alchemy. And do I even really need to tell you Roy Mustang's accolades? After getting surprised by lust and stabbed through the stomach, he uses his own flame alchemy to sear the wound closed, and then proceeds to absolutely incinerate lust. And then after Envy tries to kill Riza Hawkeye, Colonel Mustang runs up on him and deletes him. Even when Envy assumes his ultimate form, a amorphous green blob with screaming faces coming out of it that looks like a 10-foot tall lizard, Colonel Mustang just delivers one of the coldest lines in anime history and goes, "You've just given me a bigger target." Now, Envy is undoubtedly top 3 strongest homunculi. Father, Wrath, Pride, Envy, 4. And for him to be blatantly disrespected by Colonel Mustang 2 separate times truly speaks to this alchemist's power. But while people might call Colonel Mustang the 3rd protagonist of this show, he's not the 1st protagonist of this show, because coming in at number 3 is Edward Elric. Here's the thing. I'm gonna give you a little peek behind the curtain here. Van Hohenheim and Father are my 1-2 spots. Now, I understand that Father isn't really an alchemist. He's obviously a homunculi. He was the first homunculi. But a lot of people, when they're doing their strongest alchemist list, always include Father and Van Hohenheim. Now, Van Hohenheim, I understand, because he was always a human. So going Van Hohenheim and then Edward Elric, that makes sense to me. But if you didn't want to include either Father or Van Hohenheim, then yes, Edward Elric would be number 1. But in this list, he's number 3. Caveat over. Edward Elric, also known as our Full Metal Alchemist, lost his right arm and his left leg when trying to bring back not only his mother, but also his brother after the attempt to bring back the mother. It was a rough day. However, fortunately for Edward Elric, he happened to live next to one of the greatest automail technicians in the history of man, Winry, who would later become his wife, and therefore losing his arm and his leg actually wasn't the end of the world. On top of this, it granted Ed the ability to use alchemy without drawing a transmutation circle, as simply by clasping his hands, he was creating a circle of energy in his own body, and since he had gone through the gate of truth, that's all you need. Ed is the youngest ever state-certified alchemist, getting his state certification at 12 years old. And there's a reason he got that certification younger than any other alchemist in history. One, because him and Alphonse were such alchemical geniuses that by the time that they were 9 years old, they figured, oh, we can probably pull off human transmutation. And sure, was that technically a really dumb thing to do? Yeah, but the fact that they had enough alchemical knowledge and know-how to figure out how they would do it is still very impressive. But once again, that dumb thing did end up with Ed having 2 automail limbs. And since, like Alphonse, he now had metal limbs, he was able to transmute said limbs, which is kind of Ed's favorite thing to do, mostly adding a blade to the end of his automail arm. But on top of being a genius alchemist, Ed and Alphonse also both trained with Izumi Curtis, probably the greatest martial artist in the entirety of the Full Metal Alchemist universe. And thus, on top of being a genius alchemist, Ed is a genius martial artist, being one of the most competent and deadliest close quarter combat fighters in the entirety of his universe. See, Ed's mastery over alchemy started at a very young age, as he raised himself reading all of his father's alchemical, chemistry, and biological textbooks, gaining mastery with alchemy so quickly that it baffled his mother. But you know what baffled Ed's mother more than his ability to pick up alchemy quickly? Surviving. She died, and thus Ed and Al committed themselves to pulling off human transmutation and bringing her back to life. However, upon very much not doing that, Ed had to quickly act in order to save the only person he had left, Alphonse. And in a true demonstration of just how much information and knowledge Ed had in his brain at a very young age, in a matter of seconds, Ed jumps into action and binds Alphonse's soul to a suit of armor. Something most state-certified alchemists not only wouldn't have been able to do, but also probably wouldn't have thought of. But obviously, Ed, as the main character of this show, has tons of impressive feats. I mean, Ed went toe-to-toe with Scar, Greed, and even, most famously, Father. But the true mark of Ed's strength is his adaptability. See, Ed kind of has a Sharingan. Any kind of alchemy that Ed sees once, he's able to adapt into his own fighting style. After fighting Scar, Ed was able to deduce how he uses deconstruction alchemy and begin to use it himself. And he did the same thing after watching Alex Armstrong use his gauntlets and his stone spikes. But maybe more impressively than any of that, Ed also figured out how to pull off Greed's carbon hardening technique, which allowed Ed to make certain parts of his body hard as diamonds, all just by seeing these techniques used once. But his adaptability doesn't end there. In a battle against Pride, Edward Elric turns himself into a Philosopher's Stone. That is to say that he turns himself into a human version of a Philosopher's Stone, goes into Pride, battles his Philosopher's Stone, destroys it, and then escapes. After which, just turns himself back into a regular human. And after all of that, he battles against Father, who's basically God, and literally punches his lights out. Now, are there a lot of other factors going into this battle against Father? Yes. So was Ed fighting the Father who was able to generate many suns in his hand? No. But the fact that he was the person who dealt the finishing blow to Father definitely makes him the strongest out of the still human alchemists on this list. But since we're talking about our no longer human people, let's talk about him, because coming in at number 2 is Van Hohenheim, also known as Father, but not to everybody, just Ed and Al. See, Hohenheim, or Van Hohenheim, was a slave in a kingdom known as Xerxes. However, when the entirety of the kingdom of Xerxes is sacrificed in order to pull off what Father was trying to pull off in FMAB, that is, creating an actual Philosopher's Stone, all of the souls of Xerxes were split between Hohenheim and the entity that would later become Father, also known at that time as the Dwarf in the Flask. And thus Hohenheim, much in the same capacity as Father, is a human Philosopher's Stone, and thus he's immortal and his alchemy is able to defy the law of equivalent exchange. On top of this, he's also able to heal himself as if he were a homunculi. However, comparing him to the homunculi is disrespectful to him. See, because the stone at the center of his chest was an actual Philosopher's Stone, while the homunculi had red stones generated from Father's Philosopher's Stone. On top of this, not only does Hohenheim not need a transmutation circle to use alchemy, he can use alchemy without using his hands. In fact, he can do alchemy without using his body at all. And while we've already covered the fact that he can overcome equivalent exchange, he can also pull off biological transmutations. On top of this, since Van Hohenheim now has over 500,000 souls living inside of him, which he's conversed with each individually, not only did he learn the ins and the outs of every single one of their types of alchemy, but he's also able to plant souls places. And he's able to do alchemy at the places that he deposits souls wherever and whenever he wants. And in the beginning of the battle against Father, Hohenheim was able to deflect multiple energy blasts from Father. Mind you, at this point in time, Father was able to generate suns in his hand. In fact, Hohenheim wins the first round against Father, even as Father was throwing nuclear explosions at Hohenheim. It wasn't until Father revealed his shadow form that Hohenheim was ultimately defeated. However, forcing Father, who was the closest thing to truth on Earth this time, to reveal a second form is pretty impressive. But yes, of course, if you're considering Father as an alchemist, which I don't really do, then he would be the strongest alchemist on Earth. So we would have to give, in this circumstance, the number 1 spot to Father. But here's my thing. Whatever you call Father, the Dwarf in the Flask, the first homunculus, Father, he is that second thing, the first homunculus. And he's actually really not even that. Father originally started as piece of an entity that existed beyond the Gate of Truth. Essentially, a part of the entity that lived beyond the Gate of Truth was bottled and brought back to the real world. It would then live in a flask in the kingdom of Xerxes, so the king of Xerxes could treat him as a confidant. But this dwarf in the flask was considered the first homunculus. And it wasn't until the king of Xerxes was like, hey, homunculus, I want to be immortal. And the dwarf in the flask, or homunculus, who became incredibly envious of the human's ability to walk, was like, okay, fine, shed blood at all these points, then put yourself at the center of this transmutation circle. But little did he know that he was actually just sacrificing the entirety of Xerxes to give the dwarf in the flask a body body, which he completely copied from Van Hohenheim, which is why him and Van Hohenheim look exactly the same. Because the only other person who survived from the kingdom of Xerxes was Van Hohenheim, also known as number 23. But I've already explained all of Father's abilities multiple times. At his absolute strongest, after absorbing what he believed was God, which is the entity beyond the gate of truth that he was sectioned off from originally, when in actuality God is truth, the person in front of the gate of truth, he used the power of all of the Emestrian souls that he had absorbed to stabilize the power of God within his body. And in this significantly younger looking form, he was able to do basically everything. He is able to completely defy the natural order of the universe. That is to say that whatever he wants to do will be accomplished. He can manipulate matter and energy to its fullest extent, meaning he can turn anything into anything at any scale, meaning he could turn this mouse into a 36-foot tall actual mouse. Also being able to create any force at any magnitude, meaning he can create gravity, repulsive force, attractive force at whatever level he wants, which is how he was able to do things like generating a miniature sun within his hand, while also being able to fire off nuclear explosions at Hohenheim. However, as he slowly begins to lose the Emestrian souls that he has inside of him, he loses the ability to retain the god that he absorbed, and thus slowly but surely the entity beyond the gate begins to rebel against its vessel, leaving Father unable to move, which is when Ed decides to throw about 6 right crosses into his face. And then Father, as a last-ditch effort, tries to absorb Greed so he can use his ultimate defense, but Greed turns his body into graphite and he shatters. But for a while there, he was really chiefin'. So if you want to consider the Dwarf in the Flask, Father, the first homunculus, as an alchemist, which I wouldn't, yes, he would be number 1 on the list. But in actuality, it's probably Hohenheim. And if you don't want to consider Hohenheim, who is technically a human philosopher's stone, as an alchemist, then it's Ed. But what do you guys think? If you were to make a list of the top 10 strongest alchemists in FMAB, what would it look like? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, hit that noti bell. All the names in the universe number 23, we can choose anything. What do we want? Van Hohenheim? Sure.